Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and the first thing you hear on the news is this: the world's second largest economy is starting to crack, factories are slowing down, ships are sitting idle in ports, and hundreds of millions of people in massive cities are beginning to feel an energy shortage, all because of one thin strip of water on the other side of the planet. Now I know what you're thinking. That sounds like something straight out of a Tom Clancy novel, but for China, this is not fiction. This is their single biggest national security nightmare, and today we are going to break down exactly what that nightmare is, how China tried to solve it with one of the most ambitious engineering projects in modern history, and what it all means for America and the rest of the world. Stay with me, because this story connects oil tankers, mountain pipelines, military strategy, and the future of global power all in one straight line. So let's start with one place on the map that most Americans have never heard of but probably should know about: the Strait of Malacca. This is a narrow waterway sitting between Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. It connects the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. And at its narrowest point, it is only about 1.5 miles wide. 1.5 miles. Now here is why that tiny measurement matters so much. Almost everything manufactured in East Asia depends on energy that passes through this single strip of water. Electronics, cars, clothing, appliances, all of it. The factories that make those things run on oil and gas. And that oil and gas has to get there somehow. Every year, thousands of ships pass through the Strait of Malacca. Oil tankers, cargo ships, container vessels. It is the busiest and most strategically important maritime choke point on the entire planet. And China has a massive problem with it. Here is that problem. China today is the world's largest importer of crude oil. Every single day, more than 10 million barrels of oil arrive in China. To put that number in perspective, that is enough oil to fill roughly 400 Olympic swimming pools. Every single day. And the overwhelming majority of that oil comes from the Middle East and Africa, which means it has to travel thousands of miles across the Indian Ocean, and then pass through the Strait of Malacca. For years, roughly 80% of China's oil imports came through this single choke point. 80%. Now here is where it gets dangerous. China does not control this strait. It sits between Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, and the United States Navy maintains a very significant presence throughout this entire region. So think about what that means from China's perspective: their entire industrial economy, their factories, their power grid, their transportation system, their military readiness. Everything ultimately depends on a narrow strip of water that a rival superpower could theoretically close off during a conflict. That is not a small problem. That is an existential vulnerability. Chinese strategists even gave it a name: the Malacca Dilemma. And once you understand the Malacca Dilemma, everything China has been doing in terms of infrastructure and foreign investment over the last 20 years starts to make a lot more sense. So, China's leadership faced a very direct question: do you leave your entire economy dependent on a choke point you cannot control, or do you build an alternative? And if you build an alternative, how exactly do you do that? You cannot build a new ocean, you cannot move the Strait of Malacca. But you can build a pipeline, and that is exactly what China did. This is where the China Myanmar Pipeline system comes in, a roughly $7 billion infrastructure project that runs from the western coast of Myanmar all the way through mountains, jungles, and some of the most remote terrain on Earth directly into southern China. Now, look at a map of Asia, and Myanmar's position immediately jumps out at you. Myanmar sits right on the Bay of Bengal, which means oil tankers coming from the Middle East can reach Myanmar's western coast without ever going near the Strait of Malacca. They bypass the choke point entirely. The port at Kyaukphyu on Myanmar's western coast becomes the landing point. Oil arrives there by tanker, it gets pumped into the pipeline and travels overland directly into China's Yunnan province. Simple idea, incredibly difficult execution. The China Myanmar Pipeline is actually two parallel pipelines running the same basic route: a natural gas pipeline that came online in 2013, and a crude oil pipeline that became operational in 2017, both starting at Kyaukphyu Port on Myanmar's coast and ending at the city of Kunming, deep inside China. The total distance, including China's domestic network, stretches over 1,500 miles, and building it was one of the most technically challenging construction projects of the modern era. Think about what those construction crews had to deal with. Dense tropical jungle where roads simply did not exist. In many cases, they had to build the roads first just to get the heavy machinery in, then mountain ranges requiring tunnels drilled directly through solid rock. River crossings requiring specially engineered pipeline bridges. Monsoon seasons that turned construction sites into mud pits. Landslide risks throughout the mountain sections, and remote villages with no existing infrastructure of any kind anywhere nearby. The pipeline inside Myanmar alone runs nearly 500 miles. The crude oil pipeline can move approximately 440,000 barrels of oil per day. The gas pipeline can deliver roughly 12 billion cubic meters of gas every year, and the entire system requires pumping stations, compressor stations, pressure monitoring equipment, and around-the-clock operation centers managing thousands of miles of active pipelines simultaneously. This was not just an engineering project, this was a declaration of strategic intent. Now, before this pipeline existed, China's oil supply chain looked like this. Oil leaves the Middle East, crosses the entire Indian Ocean, squeezes through the Strait of Malacca, travels up through the South China Sea, and finally arrives at China's eastern coastal ports. Long route. Crowded route. Vulnerable route. With the Myanmar pipeline, the calculation changes completely. Tankers unload at Kyaukpyu and oil goes directly overland into China. The Malacca chokepoint is bypassed entirely for that portion of supply. Now, to be clear, this pipeline is not a full replacement for maritime imports. China still moves the majority of its oil by sea. But here is the key strategic point. In energy security, having an alternative route matters enormously. If one route gets disrupted, the other keeps flowing. You're not trying to eliminate risk, you're trying to distribute it. And, Myanmar is just one piece of a much larger puzzle, because China did not stop there. In Central Asia, China built a massive gas pipeline system running through Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan, multiple lines collectively capable of delivering roughly 55 billion cubic meters of gas to China every year, all overland. All bypassing maritime choke points completely. Then, there's the power of Siberia pipeline, running from Russia through nearly 2,000 miles of Siberian terrain directly into northeastern China. It's capable of delivering approximately 38 billion cubic meters of gas annually. Then there's the Kazakhstan to China oil pipeline, stretching thousands of miles across Central Asian terrain, and then the ambitions around Gwadar Port in Pakistan, which, if fully developed, would give China yet another Indian Ocean access point, bypassing Malacca from a completely different direction. Now, step back and look at what China has actually built here. Energy corridors coming from the north through Russia, energy corridors coming from the west through Central Asia, energy corridors coming from the southwest through Myanmar, and, potential future corridors through Pakistan. This is not a collection of separate infrastructure projects. This is a deliberate, coordinated geopolitical strategy to ensure that no single choke point and no single adversary can hold China's economy hostage. But here is where the story gets complicated, because pipelines have their own vulnerabilities that are very different from ships. A ship can change course, a pipeline cannot. A tanker can be rerouted around a conflict zone in a matter of days. A pipeline sits in the ground, exactly where it was built, and it cannot move. Myanmar itself has experienced significant political instability in recent years. A pipeline running through a politically unstable country is, well, a fixed target. Any disruption, whether from internal conflict, sabotage, or political breakdown, can interrupt the flow. And China cannot simply redirect that pipeline the way it can redirect a fleet of tankers. So what China actually did was trade one type of risk for another. It reduced its dependency on a maritime choke point it could not control. But it created a new dependency on fixed infrastructure running through countries with their own complex and unpredictable politics. The risk did not disappear, it just changed shape. Now, you might be wondering why any of this matters to someone sitting here in the United States. Here is the direct answer. China's energy security strategy directly affects American foreign policy, American military planning, and the global balance of power. Every pipeline China builds through Central Asia strengthens China's relationships with countries that the United States also considers strategically important. Every port China develops on the Indian Ocean is a potential future naval and logistics asset. And every step China takes to reduce its Malacca vulnerability makes China slightly more capable of sustaining a prolonged geopolitical confrontation with the United States, if one were ever to happen. The Strait of Malacca is one of the few natural leverage points the United States has over the Chinese economy. China knows this, and China has been spending billions of dollars and decades of effort methodically trying to reduce that leverage. That is the real story behind the Myanmar Pipeline. It is not just about moving oil, it is about moving the balance of power. So here is what you should take away from all of this. In the 21st century, energy is not just an economic issue. Energy is national security. The country that controls its own energy supply, or at least diversifies it enough that no single point of failure can cripple it, holds a fundamental strategic advantage. China identified its critical vulnerability a long time ago, and it has been methodically, patiently, and expensively working to reduce that vulnerability ever since. Whether that strategy ultimately succeeds is still an open question. Pipelines can be targeted, political relationships can collapse, and no infrastructure project, no matter how ambitious, can fully replace the flexibility of sea power. But the ambition and the scale of what China has built over these past 2 decades is genuinely impossible to ignore. Pipelines through mountains, energy corridors across deserts, ports on 3 different oceans, and an interconnected domestic network tying it all together into one massive system. This is what 21st century great power competition actually looks like. Not just armies and navies facing off on a battlefield, but pipelines and ports and the quiet, patient, decades-long construction of energy independence. And the next time you fill up your gas tank or pay your electricity bill, just remember there are people in Beijing and Washington both thinking very carefully about how that energy gets from where it is to where it needs to be. Because whoever controls that answer controls a whole lot more than just the energy.